Hello, everyone. I'm going to do a discussion now of two stories that are both very good and very, very, very different. So I want to kind of go through this first one because its structure is actually far more normal uh, as to what we would see in a normal story or film or whatever. And I actually want to go through, and you can see these numbers here. I've actually labeled certain parts of the story 1 through 22 to kind of show you how that 22 step outline that we looked at earlier, how that functions. Okay. This is by George Saunders, very famous short story writer now. It's from his book 10th of December. The story is called Escape from Spiderhead, a very engaging title. Like you all remember from intro, titles are very important. Now, this actually, the escape here sets up part of the plot. Okay, so we know already, there's going to be some kind of escape. Now, what is Spiderhead? We don't know. What I'm going to do is I'll put this, I think this story should be up in PDF form in the reading section. I'm going to put a bunch more stories up so that you guys can keep reading and reading and reading. But I'm not going to go through the plot outline here and the narrative too much, but I just want to point to certain parts in the story and show you how these are arriving. Now, sometimes, you might see the backstory or story world or, the desire a little bit differently, okay? I just went through this, and if you disagree on certain points, that's fine. No big deal. But the story opens up in, it's kind of hard to distinguish at first what's happening because it just starts up with drip on, what's in it, hilarious, acknowledge. You don't quite know what's going on. Now, after a while, we start to get a sense of, okay, this is how it's working. Okay. This is what's going on. Here, Saunders gives us, now number 2, remember that's backstory and story world. Okay. We start to get a little bit of a sense of what is bothering our main character, Jeff. We don't know a lot about him yet, obviously. We just kind of know that he's in this very strange situation, this very strange predicament. Now, self-revelation, okay, comes about, this is part of it right here. Now, Saunders in this story is pacing his self-revelation, the need and desire. He's pacing it a little bit differently, okay? And you'll start to see as you read and reread the story exactly what he's doing. But this is kind of a very early gesture at one of the major distinctions that Saunders makes in this story. And the major distinction, spoiler alert, is trying to kind of identify and define what it means to be human. That's a very profound question. And what I found is that the story does a very good job of this because we have all of these elements going on in here, like Verbaluse, Mobipack, and they're all followed with these little trademark symbols, indicating that all of these drugs, are owned by some company. Okay. Now, these drugs influence feelings, thought. Now, in a more complex way than we would see drugs today. Okay, so it's not just a kind of critique of corporate culture. Rather, it's a critique of how people allow themselves to be controlled and manipulated. This is one of the many themes that run through this, by capitalist systems, okay, especially here, big pharma. The deeper question that he's actually pushing toward is, well, if our brains dictate our thoughts and emotions, which they do, okay, if you didn't have a brain, you're not going to have any emotions. Sorry, not going to have any thought. But so we know a lot about the brain now. We know that it's this complex, the most complex thing we know of in the universe. But this complex electrochemical thing stuck in our heads okay, that create conscious thought, that create our emotions. Now, the question that he's asking in this story is, well, if we can just take a drug, as these people do, they're being experimented upon. You'll find out why here in a minute. If we can just take a drug and fall in love, fall out of love, speak well, be depressed, not be depressed, have sexual desire, love turned on immediately, then have that wear off, right? Well, if we can do all of these things through a drug, and it's only temporary, remember, well, what then makes us human? Those drugs are external to our experience, okay? Is there anything inherently internal, this story seems to ask, that makes us special or important or who we are, right? That gives us our sense of autonomy, okay? So here, Saunders is starting to set this up. Now, notice we don't get a lot of exposition. He's not banging you over the head with what's happening. He lets the story just kind of develop at its own pace. Okay? Here in this area, especially here, we get a stronger sense of exactly what is going on here. Okay? Because all of a sudden, these two people, Jeff and Heather, they're both given this drug, and then they fall in love and they're having sex. Okay? And you're starting to get a stronger sense of like, oh, geez, this is kind of strange. Like, what is going on here? So in that sense of trying to develop need and desire, okay, we start to get this sense of what Saunders is doing here, that Jeff is in this predicament, and we could call that part of his desire, but it seems to be hinting at his need, and we'll find out exactly what that is here in a bit. Now, I didn't go through and mark every single paragraph as to what it's doing. You can read it and you can mark those. I'm just giving you the kind of broad strokes and saying, in this section, this is what's going on, okay? So, skip ahead. Here, this is where we get a very clear indication as to what Jeff needs, okay? What is the moral question of Jeff, of this story, okay? It says, Jeff, Abnesti said, irritated as if trying to remind me that I was not here by choice, but because I had done my crime and was in the process of doing my time. Okay, so now we know he's a criminal. All of a sudden now, we get this, it's clear that this is some kind of research facility being conducted, with experiments being conducted on prisoners, okay? So these people aren't here against their will, or aren't here of their free will, they're being held. Now that is, once again, that's something that is technically unethical in today's standards, even though not terribly long ago, medical standards were not remotely as ethical, okay? Now, another thing to point out here in this section, right before, please don't do this in your stories and mark them out like 2, 3, 4, okay? This is a much longer story, and so it does need these. Unless you're writing something like 40, 50 pages long, you don't need to break them up into chapters or numbered chapters. Now, he mentions this thing here, okay? He says, after snack, Abnesti called me to control being like the head of a spider. Now we know where the title comes from, with its various legs being our workrooms. Sometimes we were called upon to work alongside Abnesti in the head of the spider, or as we termed it, the spider head. Now, why is this important? Well, I talked about one of the major themes, right? Who are we, how are we, what we are, and who we are, etc. If you ever go and look at neural networks, okay, this is evoking, at least, an image of a neural network in the brain. Okay? So now we have a dual level to understand escape from Spiderhead. Okay? It's not just a physical escape, that would be the desire level. Okay? That's what he wants, maybe to escape from this terrible place. But think about that. Escape from your brain. Can you escape from your brain? Okay, well, if you can't, then how do you change yourself? How do you become a better person, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? So you see that it's a pretty good use of title there to kind of build theme and then to create multiplicity of meanings or multiplicity of interpretations. There's nothing ambiguous about it. It's a pretty clear use of metaphor there and image to create that symbolism. Now once again, we get a little fateful night, okay? And here we get, so that's a little bit of backstory. Then we get number 3. Here's the weakness and need, okay? This is where we start to deepen the character, where we start to develop the character in interesting ways. And like I said, the story has to have a psychological need for the character, but more importantly, a moral, okay? The psychological aspects can probably be solved by solving the desires of the character. The moral need of the character, okay, can only be solved by that character's needs. So you see how they're all kind of related. Now, he feels sorry. I was so sorry about it, and blah, 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 blah. And so we see that Jeff is consumed by guilt, okay? He's done something. We don't quite know what it is yet. I think that if we found out this early in the story what he'd done, it might make him less agreeable to us. We might think, oh, well, you're kind of a rotten person. And that would destroy the possibility of the story for change. And the change in this story, as you'll see, comes through a sense of forgiveness. So here, this leads us to number 5, which is to say the guilt, right? That's his desire, part of his desire. He wants to be forgiven, but does forgiveness come from internally or externally, right? Now, where's number 4? Well, like I said, Saunders is not following this pattern exactly. Okay, you don't have to follow it exactly, but I do want you to try to follow it as closely as possible. I just like this image here. In fact, it's made me laugh out loud when I first read it all those years ago. It says on page 59, "We got some rough customers in here. I noticed that Rogan had a tattoo of a rat on his neck, a rat that had just been knifed and was crying. But even through its tears, it was knifing a smaller rat who just looked surprised." So it's such a strange image, but it's just very funny to imagine somebody with that tattoo on his neck. Saunders is very good at that, at dropping in somewhat random but very funny images into his and details into his story. Okay, now here we get when we've seen a lot of characters up to this point. We've had Abnesti, Verlaine, and Heather, I believe, up to this point. Now all of a sudden we get all kinds of other characters. Now we have here a potential ally or a fake ally opponent in terms of Keith and Rogan. Now, these guys, as you'll see here in this little funny diagram, basically these 3 guys are taking drugs with these other women, and then they are having sex with these women, and the women are having sex with them, and then they are being questioned whether there's any residual intimacy or feelings or anything, okay? Whether these drugs wear off. So normally, in a normal story, these guys would be either potential opponents because they would be vying for these women. The women might be fake ally opponents. I think that what Saunders does in this story, he doesn't really have any strong opponent, and he doesn't really have any strong fake ally opponent. I think that everybody is just kind of there. And that's another thing. Like, it's not like Jeff creates strong friendships or bonds with any of these other people, because in this situation, even though they're all prisoners, right, it's almost like they don't have much access to most of their own feelings, you know, and for various reasons. So I think that's quite consciously done on purpose. Moving right along. Now here we get yet another kind of move in the story where Jeff is asked about yesterday when he said he's just had sex with these two women, and Abnesti asks him, well, we're going to give one of them Darken Phlox. And Darken Phlox is evidently some drug in the story that just, it's like depression, anguish, despair, existential crisis times 100. Okay? It's the worst feeling you can possibly have. A terrible feeling. And so Jeff said, well, I don't want to give either one of them anything, right? And Abnesti says, well, which one do you like more? You know, trying to kind of tease out of Jeff any sort of allegiance or any sort of emotion, any sort of emotional reaction to what he's been through. And so this kind of sets into context, okay, exactly what's going on. Now, in terms of Jeff's desire, right, his desire here is to not hurt anyone. Jeff seems like a pretty, normal type of guy. Now, the question that I would ask, as I said earlier, is Abnesti an opponent, or fake ally opponent, or fake opponent ally? I think, when I was thinking of this, I think you can make the case for any single one of them. Okay? Any single one of them works. He's not really his buddy. He's not really his direct enemy. He's just a doctor there, researching. Okay, so we'll skip to here. Now, here on page 71, we get our first real revelation, decision, change of desire, change of motive. Okay? And this is part of where they have given Heather Darken Phlox and kind of made Jeff watch to see his reaction. And she basically tries to kill herself with a chair leg. So it's not like they have access to sharp objects. So she tries to kill herself with a chair leg. And this has an obvious effect on Jeff. He feels this is horrible, what's going on, right? And this is where we have our first real revelation, change of motive, change of desire, okay? Here, these two come in pretty rapid succession. Plan, right? We start to see Jeff concocting plans, and then we have a kind of attack, right? Now, this is, like I said, this is not like some, direct attack on that Abnesti is doing on Jeff, but it's opposition. So Abnesti and Verlaine start this kind of opposition to Jeff's plan. All right. Number 12 here hits on page 74, right in this spot. And that is to say, drive. Okay. Once again, the hero has to struggle to overcome the opponent's plan. And this helps to push the story forward. Now, notice that Saunders does repeat certain elements of, the testing and all of this, but each time it seems to have a different effect. It seems to not repeat itself in this way. Okay. Where are we? Here, once again, we get a little bit of backstory. All of a sudden, now this is toward the very end of the story, okay? And I think that you could read this in many ways. I think that holding heavy exposition like this to the end of stories, not the very end, but toward the end, is actually a pretty useful technique, okay? Because then it doesn't foreshadow too much. It doesn't stain our perceptions. If you knew, as you'll find out here, that Jeff was a murderer who murdered his friend for basically no reason, well, you might think of him as a pretty terrible person. But you've learned through the story that, well, he's not. He just made a really terrible mistake and feels terrible about it and is still punishing himself. Okay? So we learn here a little bit more backstory. Then we have here, once again, attack by, this would be, a 13 is technically attack by ally or fake opponent ally. I don't think that this is necessarily an attack by ally. Rather, I think it's just a using another character as further motivation, okay? Where Jeff is presented with another problem that he has to solve, okay? So they're going to give Rachel Darkened Flocks, okay? So you could see that, well, I guess I would make Amnesty, even though he's not directly mentioned in this spot. So Amnesty becomes a kind of the attacker, the opponent. Jeff has to try to save Rachel. Okay? Here we have apparent defeat. I had to think, what were they going to do? He doesn't know what to do. He's kind of lost in thought here. Doesn't know what to do. Doesn't know what to do. And then here we see 15, second revelation and decision. He has a changed desire, changed motive. What does he do? Okay, he basically takes the Darkened Flocks himself. Okay, instead of Rachel, he sacrifices himself for her. Now, remember, he doesn't love her. He's not, she's not his friend. Okay, they're just, and some of them are described as pretty terrible people. Okay, but once again, this is about the idea of redemption, that even the worst among us, okay, it can at least potentially be redeemed in some way. Now, remember, like with number 16, if you think back, that's audience revelation. Okay. The problem here is that, like I said in the other lecture, you can't have an audience revelation that's too far outside of the character's revelation. Okay, because this is third person, limited omniscient, and not a film. Okay, you can't really just pull something out of nowhere in that type of story. Here, over on page 79, we have 17, 18, and 19 basically all hitting simultaneously, and we also have what I would call 21. So we have 18 and 19, that is the gate gauntlet visit to, or sorry, 17. We have third revelation, change in desire. Okay, what does he do here? Now here, he's Darkened Flocks. He's just this overwhelming horror, terror, and he kills himself with the corner of a desk. Okay. How exactly, I don't know. It's not explained, but you can draw your own conclusions. Third revelation and decision. He makes a choice, kills himself. Okay. Now, then we have gate, gauntlet, and for Jeff, at least, a literal visit to death. Like I said, it doesn't always have to be death. It can be a psychological visit to death, metaphoric, whatever. Now, the battle is basically the same thing. I mean, he kills himself, right? So the battle is really between Jeff and himself, Jeff and his conscience. Okay, and then all of a sudden, it's a really kind of beautifully written ending. Oh, sorry. 21 is the moral decision. 21 is moral decision. So all of these basically hit at the same time. Okay. So then all of a sudden he has this out of body experience, and he kind of just floats up through the roof. Okay. There's another type of battle here. Okay, where he's now, it's not just physical. Now it's more the soul. It's more emotion, right? So the battle has moved from that of the desire to that of the need. Now here, he makes one more moral decision. Okay, That moral decision here is this little part here. It says, from somewhere, something... Oops. This whiteboard program is annoying. It says, from somewhere, something kind asked, would you like to go back? It's completely up to you. Your body appears salvageable. Now you see, now he has a choice. I mean, he could go on living. But he says, no, I thought, no thanks. I've had enough. My only regret was Mom. I hoped someday, in some better place, I'd get a chance to explain it to her, and maybe she'd be proud of me one last time after all these years. Somebody's at my door. Isn't that just like a delivery person to show up in the middle of reading the end of a story by George Saunders? Okay, so he's hoping that his mother will forgive him. He's trying to forgive himself, and in killing himself and making himself a sacrifice to save Rachel, essentially, we have a kind. I mean, there is a strong Christian parallel in that, the sacrifice in the Bible. But the story ends here. From across the woods, as if by common accord, birds flew from their trees and darted upward. I joined them, flew among them. They did not recognize me as something apart from them, and I was happy, so happy, because for the first time in years, and forevermore, I had not killed and never would. So you see, in that sense of killing himself, okay, making that sacrifice, it allows him this new equilibrium, the number 22 here, okay? Now he, because he's dead, has not killed and never would. And so it's just a really beautiful ending to the story. I just wanted to kind of map that out for you and show you that this is a very common pattern, and you can build really good stories so long as you think in these terms, okay? So if you have a story you're working on, try to build these into the story as you're revising it. Even if you already have one from intro or others that you've written, build these into your stories. Okay, this is clearly a more advanced technique than what we were looking at in intro, but there it is. This whiteboard is kind of confusing because basically everything just exists on this infinite page. And so I could literally scroll left or right and for indefinitely, forever. And, well, not forever. Don't forget, infinity is not a number, it's a concept. Infinity technically doesn't exist, even though it kind of does because of calculus, etc. Anyway, this is not a math class. Okay. Now I want to look at a very different story that I will put online as well. This is called The Theme of the Traitor and the Hero by Jorge Luis Borges. I know I put some of his work up last semester, I'm pretty sure. And I really like Borges. He's really fun to read. He's very strange, very cerebral. His stories are, if you imagine the exact opposite of something like Saunders. Saunders is telling you a story. We learn about the characters. We care about them. We hate them, right? In Borges, it's a totally different endeavor. And the story here, the theme of the traitor and the hero, this is what I would call not just meta-fiction, but meta-fiction. Okay, remember from last year or last semester, whenever it was, that meta-fiction is fiction written with the knowledge that it's itself a story. Okay, the example I always use, since I assume most of you have seen it, is the movie Deadpool. That's a meta film because Deadpool is aware that he is a character in a movie sometimes. Now, the funny part of that is that because he's crazy, okay, they're playing it both ways. You know, oh, maybe he thinks he's a character in a movie because he's lost his mind, okay, but it also allows for some pretty comedic moments. Now, this story is very much the opposite of the other story, because the narrator, who's unnamed, is a writer, and he's writing a story about Ryan Kilpatrick. Okay, now that's the narrator's story's narrator. Ryan Kilpatrick is writing a book about his great grandfather, Fergus Kilpatrick. As we'll see here in a moment exactly who these people are. Now, one funny part is that in the opening of the story, the setting just changes from Poland to Ireland. The narrator's trying to figure out where he wants this story to take place. He's kind of working on the story out loud while writing it. Okay. He says Poland, Ireland, the Venetian Republic, South America, the Balkans. Eventually goes to Ireland. Okay. Now, the funny thing about this story, if you go and read it carefully, almost all the story is revelations. Revelation after revelation after revelation after revelation. And all of these start to pile up on one another. And it actually makes the story a lot of fun. Like I said, Borges is a lot of fun to read. Maybe I'll put some more of his stuff up. Okay, just to run you through this so that when you read this story, I want you to notice what Borges is doing in here. Okay. Ryan, now that's the grandson. This is the story inside the story. Okay, let me show you how Borges is structuring this, because you probably haven't read this yet. Wait, where did I put it? Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't copy and paste this on here. So, I'll just talk about this. So it starts off. I'll just read it to you. This is the opening of the story. Under the notable influence of Chesterton, contriver and embellisher of elegant mysteries, and the palace councillor Leibniz, inventor of the pre-established harmony, in my idle afternoons, I have imagined this story plot, which I shall perhaps write some day, and which already justifies me somehow. Details, rectifications, adjustments are lacking. There are zones of the story not yet revealed to me. Today, January 3rd, 1944, I seem to see it as follows. And so you see that this unnamed narrator then goes into the story that he's sort of working on in his mind, but hasn't really figured out entirely yet. Okay? That's a very strange way to open a story. And he is throwing some references to some historical characters in there. So here's the story within the story. Ryan, the grandson, is writing a story about his great-grandfather, a national hero in Ireland who was assassinated at a theater. Sound familiar? He learns some strange details that Fergus, his grandfather, received warning him not to attend the theater. You know, Caesar, Lincoln, right, assassinated in similar places. So he's setting up parallels. Okay, that's the literary parallel. Now, Ryan says he started to sense there are strange historical patterns whose design he might learn. He mentions Hegel, Spengler, and Vico. The Phenomenology of Spirit is Hegel's big work. Spengler wrote about the decline of civilization. Vico wrote a book called The Nuova Scienza, which is about cycles. All of these thinkers saw history as a cyclical thing and almost always degenerative. Okay, so history was always kind of moving down. I think he also mentions Hesiod, the Greek poet, who talks about the degeneration of the soul and how people, generation to generation, age to age, kind of decline. Ryan, now this is all taking place in the story. Ryan learns that a beggar spoke to Fergus the exact same words as in Macbeth. That sounds kind of strange, okay? So now we have Shakespeare being involved. Ryan discovers that Fergus's ally and friend, Nolan, had translated Shakespeare into Gaelic. So you see, it's just reveal, 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 reveal. Ryan learns that Fergus, against his kindly nature, had ordered an execution days before his own death. Okay. Now, that's against Fergus. He was apparently a very nice and kind and benevolent person, etc., etc. So why did he order an execution? That doesn't sound like him. Aha! It turns out that Fergus, the grandfather, had charged Nolan, his friend, with finding a traitor in the group. Nolan investigates, and that traitor, lo and behold, was Fergus himself. Dum dum dum. Nolan then sets up a dramatic ploy whereby Fergus would be assassinated in a grand way, like Caesar and Lincoln. That should be an E, to die a hero and not jeopardize the cause. They were kind of revolutionaries working on this plot, right? So it turns out that the main hero of the story within the story was, in fact, a traitor to his own cause. Now, yeah, so they created this. He consented to be assassinated. So that's the execution days before his death, is his own death. Okay, to die here and not jeopardize the cause. Now this starts to nudge the idea of history toward irony and ambiguity. Why? Because when we start to think of these events that happen in the past, we tend to think of history as more or less factual, right? But here we have a fake story within a story that is itself a fake story. Okay, so you see all these layers. These are structural ironies inherent to the story, and it starts to question, well, is anything true? Right? That ambiguity lays that out quite nicely. Is anything even true? Now, because time was short, Nolan stole elements from Shakespeare of this assassination plot. Now, okay, so he steals elements from Shakespeare, which is why we have him quoting Macbeth earlier. So now we have, essentially, now I used play here because Shakespeare made a joke about this at one point, but we have a play within a play within a play within a play. Okay, actually I think it should be one more if I remember the numbering correctly. I think there's 5 levels to this. So he steals the elements from Shakespeare to make the scheme more convincing. Now, okay, so he steals from Shakespeare to make the scheme convincing. Well, that's art stealing from life. Okay, or sorry, that's art trumping real life. So the details that he could come up with, right, to be plausible or whatever, those wouldn't have made the story convincing. So he steals from Shakespeare, right? Okay, well, if everything's stolen and borrowed and based on something else, right, what's true? Now, Ryan, remember, the grandson, realizes that Nolan intended the Shakespearean elements to lead to the eventual discovery of the entire plot. Okay, so he's using Shakespeare. So Nolan used Shakespeare so that a writer, somebody who writes fake people that don't exist. Othello didn't exist, but he exists as a character. Okay? So he used these elements so that somebody would later find the truth, the real plot that Fergus, right, was a traitor. Well, once again, which is more real? The idea here is that art somehow leads to the truth. So like a detective story using art instead of forensic facts or evidence. Okay? So art is more true in this sense in the story than reality itself, even though art, irony, is itself not quote unquote true. Okay, so now Ryan knows the truth. He knows, oh, my great-grandfather was a traitor. Should I write this book? And he does write a book, but he decides to keep the secret and publishes a book praising Fergus. Okay, so now we have another reveal, another layer in this story. Here, the truth that Fergus was good, which everyone believes, is a lie. But in a sense, is it moral or right or just to lie about such a thing? Right? The question here, I think, goes in many directions. But I mean, if we think about it, if we look at some of history's, great people, whoever those people are, do we always want to know the ugliest truths about them? Right? Do we really need to know? I mean, if they did something great, right? But we're human and flawed and all of that. I think nowadays it's called cancel culture, where somebody said maybe 20 years ago, when they were younger, maybe more naive, can sort of come back to haunt them. It's a very strange concept to me. So, for this tiny story, however, Borges, he wrings as much irony, playfulness, seriousness, and ambiguity as he can out of it. Okay? Almost all of the elements of a story I discussed, all those 22 steps, fall apart in most of Borges's stories. Now, almost all of his stories are like this. I'm looking right now at two of his books, The Aleph and Labyrinths, both very, very fun books. Most of his stories aren't all that long, too, so you can usually get through them pretty quickly. But what he does is he's constantly bringing up these large, what is truth, if not an illusion, sort of elements. Now, what's the plot of the story? I mean, can we even ask about the plot of the story? Well, remember that Ryan and Fergus are made up. The plot is about a writer writing something about a writer writing something that isn't true, but that's true about the original writer, but also true about Borges' own story. So Borges, a writer, is writing a story about a writer, writing a story about a writer, writing a story about his grandfather, which the accounts that everybody knew, there's another layer of the story, aren't true. Okay? So, yes, like I said, there's 5 layers. There's 5 structural layers in the story itself. Now, so that the story, inside the story, contains some elements of plagiarism. Okay? That is, remember, they're stealing from Shakespeare to make the assassination plot more plausible or credible. So even the story within the story within the story, so that's not original. Even though Borges is playing with the idea of historical patterns. Okay, so to go back to Vico here, Vico thought of civilization as a cycle, okay, kind of moving from the mythic to the heroic to the democratic. And then there was a kind of, for Vico, basically civilization would reset. There would be a kind of implosion, right? Everything would fall apart. Like his big example was the Roman Empire, which eventually fell, and then we had the Dark Ages for several centuries thereafter. So he's playing with these historical patterns, borrowing from other authors in his story, or in his narrator's character's story, or wait, no. Narrator's character's grandfather's story, okay? So notice all these levels, all these machine parts working here. Now, for example, Borges has another funny story in which there's an author who sits down to write a book. And he writes, word for word, without knowing it, the book Don Quixote. Now, the joke in the story is, well, which of these is more real? If the other author didn't know Don Quixote, had never read it, and sits down and writes it word for word, which of these books is more real? So once again, you see that this is a constant theme if you go and read him in Borges in his work. He conflates several things together: history, philosophy, art, the act of artistic creation. Which one is more real or accurate? Somebody writing history, right? Remember, Ryan is trying to write a historical account of his grandfather, learns that it was all made up, and then goes along with that lie. But in a way, that lie, right, is somewhat more true because people have accepted the alternative story that Fergus was a hero. Okay, so you see how it's just irony piled on irony piled on irony. Now, like I said, the whole story, it's only about 3 pages long, is just reveal after reveal after reveal. Now, I do not recommend you try writing a story like this, okay? Because this is something that, I mean, maybe we'll look at doing in like a 300 level fiction class, you know. But I think that for our intents and purposes, we want our stories to be closer to this, okay? Some kind of good narrative, good character development, desires, needs, morals being built in that follow more or less this structure, okay? So that is just a brief discussion on these 2 stories. I just kind of wanted to point out some of the structural elements and not go too far into the interpretations of them. I will let all of you do that on your own. So thank you.